We'll get started now. We are recording this. It'll be available on YouTube. So if anybody does miss anything from the beginning, you can always go back and listen in. But I just want to say thank you, everybody, for coming along and joining us. So I'm Annie Heslop. I'm part of the Tree Council team. We're a small charity. We work together for the love of trees, everything tree related. And that includes hedgerows. So I manage the Life on the Hedge project. It's a real partnership project. So we have the People's Trust for Endangered Species, the National Hedge Laying Society, Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group, Another Way. All these charities and organisations work together to really shout out about hedgerows and how important they are, what we can do for them, how we can fundraise for more hedges, and how we can set up community growing centres to make more hedges. This week, we're really excited that it's National Hedgerow Week. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming along to celebrate hedgerows with us today. This year, we're also linking in with Plant Health Week. So we have a Healthy Hedges theme, and we've been talking all week about what it means to have a healthy hedge. So when we say healthy hedge, that means having a healthy hedge in terms of the actual plants that are in that hedge, but also healthy hedge in terms of how healthy it is to support biodiversity and what it can do for us and our health as well. But in order to know if a hedge is healthy or not, we need to get to know our hedges better. And that's why we're here today to talk about getting to know our hedges. So this might be on an individual level. You might want to have a really close look at a hedge near you, really kind of get to know it, understand what wildlife lives there, get on first name terms of all those species within your hedge. But also this can be on a national level, really understanding the picture of our landscape and where our hedges are at the moment, where they have been and where they could go with good management. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers tonight. Firstly, you're going to be hearing from Lisa Norton. She works for UK Centre of Ecology and Hydrology. She'll be talking to you all about coordinating a systematic hedgerow survey all across the country. That's going to give us really vital information on the state of our hedges. So for hedge geeks like us, it's really exciting news, all the work Lisa's doing. And after which you'll hear from hedgerow expert Megan Gimber, who's from the People's Trust for Endangered Species. She's coordinating the Great British Hedgerow Survey, which is a citizen science programme that we can all get involved in and really undertake to find out about how we can feed into hedges, but also manage the hedge that you've got in front of you. So before I hand over to Lisa, if anyone has any questions, we have a Q&A box. If you can pop your questions in the Q&A box, we'll get to them at the end of both the talks. If you can put who the question's aimed at, that's really helpful. If it's aimed at both of them, just leave it blank. But without further ado, I will hand you over to Lisa now. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you, Annie. Okay, I'm going to share my screen and let's hope this goes off fine. Is that working?
Yes, that works perfect my end. Cheers.
Okay, so yes, as Annie said, I'm Lisa Norton. I'm from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. We're a research organisation and we do quite a lot of work for government, but yeah, largely for government, but for all sorts of I suppose charitable funding and business funding, etc. So one of the things we do is to survey hedgerows, and I'm going to talk about national hedgerow surveys as part of the UK countryside survey. So I'm just moving on, trying to move on. Yeah, okay. So hedges, we all love hedges. They're familiar, they're comfortable, they are alongside us when we're on our walks, whether they be alongside a roadside or a footpath. And they bring wildlife right to us. So the first signs of spring in the bright green leaves of the hawthorn or the froth of flowers on the blackthorn. And I really love at this time of year the Gerard Manley Hopkins poem. And so I'm going to read a line of it for you. And it's a poem called Spring, and it goes like this. So nothing is as beautiful as spring, when weeds in wheels shoot long and lovely and lush. Thrush's eggs look little low heavens, and thrush through the echoing timber does so rinse and ring the ear, it strikes like lightnings to hear him sing. And for me, that really captures the wildness of hedges. The weeds in the weeds in wheels feels to me like the wildness of hedges in an otherwise very tamed landscape. And they're really key features in our landscapes, and we love to see them breaking up the fields of crops or of grassland. And they provide so much more than just a landscape or wildlife feature. They provide shelter and shade for livestock. They protect our soils from being blown away by the wind. They hold water in the landscape. The hedge roots take water down into the soil, and hedges across slopes can stop water flowing over land. And as well as all that, the soils under hedges are really rich in carbon and organic matter, and the woody species in hedgerows, the woody species themselves, the trees, really store carbon both above ground and below ground. So there's so much more than just a landscape feature, bringing all these benefits to us. So the story of hedgerow change over time in GB has been a story of land use change, documented in various historical accounts. And in the last 50 to 60 years, funding from government has been a key part of the story of hedges. And at one point, the government was encouraging the removal of hedges to increase the efficiency of production, particularly. But over more recent decades, the drive has been to preserve hedgerows and improve their management, because they're so valuable in terms of particularly biodiversity, but also landscape feature and all these other services that they provide us. And they may have become a bit less important as agricultural features. This slide shows a fairly stock-proof hedge, which actually is quite useful for stopping those lambs popping through into another field. But generally, farmers are using fences to do that rather than hedges. So now there's less of a drive for farmers to be looking after hedges in the landscape. So I think that has made it really critical to keep a track on how hedges are and how they're doing. So the Countryside Survey, which covers Great Britain, is a long-term monitoring programme. Sorry, that's a bit of a blurry one, isn't it? Long-term monitoring programme looking at countryside change in a representative sample of locations. I'm going to get to a slide. So this is a plot from Countryside Survey, but this is describes the underlying basis of Countryside Survey. So it has this sampling design, which basically stratifies the countryside. So that means on the left-hand side, there's a map of Great Britain, and all the different colours represent slightly different land types, based on all these underlying variables like climate, soils, and topography. And within those land classes, those different colours, we go and look at a certain number of 1 kilometre squares to be able to assess what's been changing in the countryside over time. And you can see that it's been roughly decadally, as I said, between 1978 and 2007. And across that time, it's always mapped the presence of hedges, measuring how long they are and what species they contain. It's also collected some detailed information about species at the base of hedges across that whole time period in a plot, which just went from the middle of the hedge outwards for 1 metre and for 10 metres along. And the survey has been really important for preserving hedgerows. It helped to show that hedgerows were still being lost. So if you look at this graph here on the right, you see the red circle around the blue dotted line. And basically that's the length of managed hedges and how they changed between 84 and 1990. And there's quite a big decrease there. And when these results were published and shown to government, they were a bit, oh goodness, we really need to do something about that. So this kind of data can really be very important. And in terms of, so when this was reported in England, at least, it was decided to bring in the hedgerow regulations. so in 1997, and this was brought in to prevent further loss of hedges without local derogation to actually remove them. The same legislation wasn't necessarily brought in Wales and Scotland, I'd add, but it's an English law, this one. And around the time that this came out, the government was really forming policy around habitats to try and protect them. And they were identifying priority habitats which were deserving of particular protection. And hedgerows with natives, comprised of native species, became one of these priority habitats. And at the time, the UK CEH worked really closely with government to think about what's the best way of monitoring these hedges, and what are the aspects of hedges that make them in good condition, so that they're providing all these different services that we want to see. And so this work also fed into decisions about how we should monitor the extent and the condition of hedges. And because Countryside Survey was the best data set providing this nationally representative sample, it was decided that we should do more in Countryside Survey with additional plots and additional measures to tell us about the condition of hedges. So a new plot was developed which specifically looked at the woody component of hedges, and quite a number of these were done in the surveys in 1998 and 2007. So the kind of things that the surveyors were measuring were the height of the hedge, and it needed to be at least 1 metre or taller, the width of the hedge, which needed to be at least 1.5 metre. And you can see this one is only just there. This is quite a tall, thin hedge, characteristic of some parts of Cumbria. And overall, the cross-sectional area needed to be over 3 metres squared. So one of the height times the width needed to be at least that. We also decided that there should be no gaps greater than 10% in a 30-metre stretch of hedgerows. And at the base of the canopy, so that's where the bushes start their outward growth, should be no higher than 0.5 metres for a hedge in good condition. So this would show that they'd been laid and were effectively regrowing for the lay, or they'd been managed so that they were producing woody shoots at the base of the hedgerow. There's also some criteria on what the associated ground should be. So there should be a width of undisturbed ground which was equal to or greater than 2 metres, and at least 1 metre of that should be perennial vegetation, so not annual vegetation. Other criteria were that there shouldn't be very many recently introduced species, so definitely less than 10%, and that there should be no invasive species like Japanese knotweed here. So quite a complex set of measurements, and these were done in CS Countryside Survey 1998 and 2007 to look at the condition of hedgerows. So as well as this data was supposed to provide evidence for some of the aims for enhancing the hedgerow priority habitat. And some of these aims were things like maintaining the net extent of hedgerows across the UK and increasing it by 800 kilometres a year between 2010 and 2015, ensuring that hedges remained at least as rich in native woody species as they were in 1998, achieving favourable condition of 50% of all hedges by 2015. So favourable condition would be all of these criteria on this picture here fulfilled, and halting further decline in the condition of the ground flora, so in the plots underneath the hedgerows, by 2010. So unfortunately, the results were not as positive as kind of hoped for between 98 and 2007. So although some of those aims were beyond 2007, already by in the period 98 and 2007, we're seeing declines in the lengths of, still continuing declines in the lengths of managed hedgerows. And instead of it being due to actual removal, as you can see in the graph, the blue line is still going down a bit across the decades to 2007. The green line is going up, and the green line is the length of unmanaged hedges, essentially, or lines of trees. So the survey was showing that actually we were still losing hedges, but this time not because they're being removed, but because they're being neglected. And we also found that the species richness of the plots at the base of the hedges was still decreasing, and over the whole period of the survey from 84 to 2007 here, or I think 86, it was 15%, or 78 actually to 2007, it decreased by 15%. So still some loss. So the other condition results from the D plot specifically were that we did actually achieve no net loss of species within the 30 metre section of hedge. So they retained their species richness of woody species. Only less than half of managed hedges were in good structural condition. So that's height times width and gappiness criteria in Great Britain in the 2007 survey. And only 10% of the managed hedges on arable were in both good structural condition and had these appropriately managed margins with the perennial vegetation and the unmanaged vegetation. So not a fantastic story really from the 2007 survey. And what's happened since 2007 is that we had a bit of a change in government and some restructuring around environmental goals and objectives. There was a real move towards the potential use of Earth observed data and volunteer data to monitor the countryside, and a bit of a shift away from ground-based professional monitoring as done in 2007 survey. And so countryside survey didn't happen again until relatively recently, and it's been rolling since 2019, but that survey doesn't include any data collection on hedges. The survey previously was funded both by DEFRA and the Welsh Government and Scottish Government, and by the research councils. The current survey is only funded by the research councils, and there's a limited amount of funding. So it was decided to do other parts of the survey and not the hedge survey. So that rolling survey, which started in 2019, didn't include any data on hedges. However, considerable investment in hedges under agri-environment schemes and a real need for evidence on the impacts of that funding pointed to the need for data that was nationally representative and would provide information on both what's happening in the wider countryside with hedges anyway, but also what's happening under schemes specifically, and have they been resulted in the kind of changes that we really want to see. So it has been over 15 years since the last survey, but as there is no other long-term monitoring representative data on hedges that we can repeat, it was decided, Natural England decided through DEFRA funding, decided to fund a repeat survey of the hedges in the English countryside survey squares, starting with the pilot in 2022 and continuing with a full survey this year. So we were training surveyors just last week and they are out, well, the week before last, and they are currently out now. And these pictures are some of the surveyors during training. So this year we have this team of surveyors visiting squares across England to remap the hedges in the squares and record any changes in their length and type, and to carry out some of these detailed plots to measure changes in condition and from the previous surveys. And the data will be used alongside the data that goes right back to 78 to tell us what's happening with our hedges, and particularly in the light of this significant government investment, sorry, I've gone too quickly, into hedges. And it's hoped that we'll not only learn how they fared under recent management, but also gain some insight into what's needed to ensure that we can have more hedges and better hedges, and thereby enhance the ecology of our agricultural lands. So that is me, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Lisa. That's absolutely fabulous. We'll go through any questions at the end, and I'll move on to Megan's presentation now. Thank you.
All right, fantastic. Bear with me while I share my screen. I hope you can all see a picture of me poking out the top of a beautifully laid hedge there. So hi, my name is Megan Gimber, and I work for a charity called People's Trust for Endangered Species, where I am the key habitats officer. It is fair to say I am a bit of a hedgerow geek, and I confess I did a little dance when I heard that the CEH were going to be redoing the countryside survey for hedgerows. Today it's provided the most important data set on hedgerows we've ever had, and has the capacity to inform so much good work at the national level. You know, we're making huge national decisions at the moment, where a lot of large scale funding is going. So having an up-to-date data set is so important. Repeat surveys, again, are the only way to get a real flavour of the trends in hedgerow health. And it's so important to see what's going on nationally with such an important habitat such as hedges. Right. Let me see, it's not moving my screen along. There we go. So it might seem odd to have created another hedgerow survey, considering how brilliant the countryside survey is, but actually it was partly the countryside survey that inspired ours. The countryside survey gives us incredible long-term data on both hedgerow extent and condition across the whole country. And again, it was statistics from that this, you know, that helped us put a greater focus on hedgerow conservation. So the statistics from the 2007 survey was mixed, as we've just heard. On one hand, we weren't losing the same lengths of hedgerow that we were before. You see that downward graph sort of leveled out a little bit. But on the other hand, it showed that our incredibly rich hedgerow network was actually still being eroded through the way that they were being managed. Some were being lost or being reduced structurally through excess management, like the one that you've got on the screen now. And others were being lost to lines of trees through lack of management. So it was becoming increasingly clear that hedgerows were not coping with the static management that they were too often receiving, and were suffering from the general move away from managing hedges on the traditional hedge life cycle. So our surveys are designed to health check hedgerows and get this important information, including bespoke management advice, directly to the people that look after these hedgerows. So at PTES, we run not one, but two different hedgerow surveys. One is the Great British Hedgerow Survey, and that's aimed at volunteers, wildlife groups, parish groups, etc. And the other one is called Healthy Hedgerows, which is a rapid condition assessment app designed specifically for farmers and landowners. More on those a bit later. So why, as an endangered species charity, why would we want to be involved in hedgerow work? Well, hedges are incredible for wildlife in general. George Eustace described them as the single most important ecological building block left in this country, and I absolutely wouldn't disagree with that. I loved your description earlier, actually. What did I say? The wildness in an otherwise tamed landscape. That's beautifully poetic. One study in British Wildlife counted 2,070 species in just 85 metres of hedgerow in Devon. 2,070 different species is enormous. Now, the vast majority of those species were insects, but of course we know how very important insects are to everything else up the food chain. And the brilliant Robert Walton, who conducted this study, thinks that even that 2,070 figure is an underestimate of the true number. And again, this was just 85 metres of hedgerow in Devon. So, you know, replicate that across the nation, and it's amazing what they can do for our wildlife. So how do they do it? Well, for wildlife, hedges have three main roles. First is a physical home. So many species use hedges as nesting or overwintering sites. So this can include birds, hibernating hedgehogs, dormice, other small mammals. Some bumblebees, for example, will nest in clumps of tusky grass at the base of a hedge. I'd say it's fairly well known that hedgerows help our native pollinator species by providing forage, nectar and pollen through the year. And that helps to support them at times when our crops aren't in flower. But actually what's, I think, less well recognised is that they also provide homes, like a physical home for these pollinators. So this can be summer breeding sites, or crucially, as uncropped land for them to overwinter in. So we have, and we need, a huge diversity of pollinator species. And these benefit from the huge diversity of nesting opportunities that our hedges can provide them. So secondly, as well as a home, they are an excellent complementary habitat. So some of our wildlife might not directly nest or hibernate in a hedgerow, but they may still rely upon a hedgerow network for more resources. So that could be food, that could be shelter, it could be for important behaviours during their life cycle. So birds may use hedgerow trees to which to sing. Some butterflies will use hedgerow trees with which to gather around and mate. Barn owls will hunt alongside hedgerows. And then we have things like fieldfares and redwings who come in winter to enjoy the hedgerow fruit during the winter months. So of the 84% of our farmland bird indicator species that make use of hedgerows, only half of them actually use hedges as their physical home. The rest of them use it mostly for food and for shelter. And thirdly, and importantly, hedges, as you probably all have heard, are fantastic wildlife corridors. So these are connecting populations across the countryside that would otherwise be isolated and vulnerable. So corridors play a vital role for species that are at risk from habitat fragmentation. And fragmentation is really serious. It's thought to be a limiting factor to the distribution of some of our species in the UK, and even a threat to survival of others. So a really big deal here. And these hedgerow corridors allow species such as bats, butterflies, moths, etc., to navigate around the countryside. So they allow other species like dormice to move between remnant patches of habitat, thereby sort of connecting populations that would otherwise be vulnerable. And actually, I'm going to focus on dormice just for a little bit longer because they are fantastically cute. Important. But they are also a really good example. So they're a great example of a creature that uses hedgerows for all three things. They use it as a home, for food, and as wildlife corridors. So we might normally think of dormice as a coppice woodland species, but they're also capable of supporting breeding populations. But to do that, they need to be good quality hedges. They need to be species rich because dormice have quite a varied diet that changes through the year. And of course, dormice are arboreal creatures, which means they prefer to travel across the branches rather than across the ground. So hedgerows provide the safest way for dormice to cross the countryside. So just a bit of context, as part of our dormouse conservation work at PTES, we reintroduced dormice to areas in the country where they have previously been lost. And before we do this, we need to make sure that these new populations aren't isolated and they have good connectivity. And again, it's hedgerows that provide that. So this connectivity for dormice means that you can have a population that can inhabit fragments of woodland that would otherwise be too small to support a viable population, but together they can. It can help gene flow between different dormouse populations in different woodlands. It can allow movement that can help recover declining populations. And it can also help dormice migrate to any suitable new habitat that might become available. And again, we've got sort of plenty of hedgerow and woodland planting schemes at the moment. So it's not inconceivable that there's going to be more habitat for them in the future. And sadly, the effects of climate change look like they are going to make this ability to relocate increasingly important for dormice. So we've already lost about 51% of our dormice since the year 2000, and we've lost them, they've gone extinct from 17 counties in the last 100 years. So it is fair to say they are in trouble. But one of the benefits of using them as a sort of flagpost species for hedges is that if we manage our hedgerows and get them right for something like a dormouse, which, you know, they are fussy little things, it means we have created a habitat that can support a broad range of other species as well. So as to how and why a man-made habitat is so good for wildlife. It's a bit complicated, but it's also fascinating. So I'll do a quick run through of this. The short version is hedgerows mimic the habitat that you find at a woodland edge. So they've got overlapping elements of woodlands, flowering scrub and grassland habitat. And this means they're capable of supporting species, many species from each of these. So, for example, they can support 80% of what we would normally call woodland bird species. So it turns out there's quite a lot of wildlife that actually thrives in this particular combination of features. And this makes hedgerows more valuable than the sum of its parts. Interestingly, the closer you look at our native ecology, the more species that you'll find thrive in this particular combination, this woodland edge habitat. And the reason for this is that it's a similar combination of features to those that you'd find in pre-agricultural wildwood, the pre-agricultural wildwood that these species may have adapted to here in the UK. So, you know, it's unlikely that we had wall-to-wall closed canopy woodland, but there's plenty of evidence, in fact, to say that we had more of a mosaic of successionary habitat. By this, I mean different growth stages, like a dynamic landscape that's sort of constantly in motion through the grazing and the browsing and the crashing and the crunching of large herbivores as they moved around the countryside. So there would have been patches of woodland, but also glades, areas of scrub, pasture, scattered trees. There would have been no sort of harsh dividing line between woodland areas and pasture. So there would have been a greater area of this woodland edge ecotone. And this mosaic of habitats will have been constantly shifting as the herbivores moved between different areas. So again, if this dynamic edge habitat that much of our wildlife will have adapted to, perhaps that explains why habitats such as hedges, traditional orchards and wood pasture are so rich in wildlife. They all replicate this. And of course, for hedgerows, we've just squeezed that amazing habitat into little corridors. And while we may have lost some of the spatial dynamism by doing that, we actually can ensure they keep this sort of temporal dynamism, this valuable succession through changing their management through time and managing them on their sort of inherent life cycle. So conveniently, this way of managing hedges is not a new thing, but actually it's what we've been doing for centuries. By managing a hedgerow according to its life cycle, we keep this succession, this dynamism. We reset the hedge succession when it gets to a point of maturity, and we create a habitat that's both useful for us as a stock-proof barrier, but also ecological dynamite for wildlife. So at this point, I would say if anybody tells you that hedges aren't important because they are just a man-made habitat or they're not natural, just ignore that. And similarly, if they say that hedges are more natural if they are left without any management or intervention at all, because it's not true. But as we know, management a hedge receives can determine how useful it is for wildlife, as well as all the other co-benefits mentioned earlier. So managing a hedge isn't always an easy thing to do. This diagram here is a very simplified version of a hedgerow management cycle based on the brilliant Nigel Adams's 10-point hedgerow code. So to a large extent, managing hedgerows like this fell out of fashion with the advent of mechanical trimming. But both our surveys are designed as tools to help understand where each hedge is on this cycle and help return it to this method of management. So this is important really because the best way to manage a hedge changes depending on where that hedge already is in this inherent life cycle. So this poster here, it does look a bit complicated at first sight, but what I really love about this diagram is that it shows that it doesn't matter where you are in this life cycle, those little arrows show you that there is a way of bringing them back into healthy condition. So it shows that hedges are dynamic, living habitats, and they need dynamic management based on their life cycle. And the problems we've seen is when they haven't had this dynamic management, it's just been static trimming or just not trimming at all. So hedges aren't green walls, they can't be treated as such. And it's not possible to keep a hedge at the same point in its life cycle without seeing some structural decline. So at the centre, of this. We've got a circle, and this is where you'll find your dense and managed hedges. So the management here might include things like rotational cutting, incremental size increase, which allows your hedge to grow slowly, even every time you cut it. And it might also include periods of non-intervention, where you maybe let your hedgerow go for a decade or so without managing it. But crucially, it will always include some form of rejuvenation, so coppicing or laying, to basically reset that hedge cycle. It's that rejuvenation that sort of resets the succession. It tops up the stem density, and stem density is something that starts to decline over time. And it gives a whole new lifespan, which sort of essentially makes our hedges immortal. The problems with hedge management are represented on the side flanks. So on the left, you will see hedges that are becoming tall and overgrown. So hedges, of course, do require some management, or they race up. They lose that scrubby growth at the base, which is fantastic for nesting birds. And because they all race up, they all become trees, but really tall ones with no sort of lower branches. It means they're fairly unstable, and you will get an increasingly gappy line of trees. On the right-hand side is the opposite side of the process, which is over-trimmed. This is over-management, trying to keep hedges in the same size and shape for too long. You can do it for a little while, but again, not for too long. So they start to develop a hard knuckle line at the trim line. They start to lose stems and become a bit gappy, and they again lose that fantastic thick structure at the base of a hedge. So I think personally, the ones on the right-hand side are a bit of a priority, because not only are we losing them, they are slowly fading from our countryside in some areas. They're actually not really fulfilling any of their benefits in the meantime. They're not really benefiting farmers. They're not really benefiting the environment or wildlife when they're in that sort of chronic over-trimmed state. So those two side flanks are what I mean when I talk about sort of dropping out of the management cycle. And again, both of our surveys use this traditional cycle at the heart of the management advice that they give out. So firstly, I will talk about our Great British Hedgerow Survey. So this survey is aimed at volunteer groups, wildlife groups, parish groups, etc. Each survey takes about 20 minutes to do. It needs to be done when hedges have leaves on them, because it does count the species within the hedgerow structure. And it provides really high quality data about hedgerow health. So when we add this survey to the website, each one gets immediate and tailored feedback, not only about the health of the hedge, including a blow-by-blow account of everywhere you might have lost points, but also it gives management advice based on that cycle that we've just seen. So we didn't need to reinvent the wheel when we created this, but we actually built on the DEFRA standard method for surveying hedges. And we were able to simplify the survey method, making it a bit more accessible without sort of compromising the integrity of the survey itself. And this is what the survey looks like in paper. It's 2 sides of A4. One side is a few questions about where the hedge is and a bit about its structure. And the other side of the page is just a list of species that we ask you to note which ones are there, and any hedgerow trees. So we look at what plant species are in the hedge, which is important because hedges with more plant species have a higher diversity of invertebrates and birds. So each plant may have things that specialise on feeding on it, but also if you've got a higher diversity of plants in there, it means you get a better year-round availability of food sources. Each one sort of flowers and fruits at different times of the year. We take rough measurements of the height and the width. So again, this is important because increasing the width and the height of a hedgerow tends to increase both the diversity and the abundance of wildlife. Not only because you get a bigger volume of habitat, which is great, but also because it increases the complexity of the hedgerow habitat. And more complex hedges are better shelter for foraging birds and reduced predation for nesting birds. So we also look at connectivity. So we both measure the hedge integrity itself, so how many gaps, etc., but also how many other hedges and other habitats each one connects to at either end. Gaps are, again, they're an important one because they are often a good indicator for hedgerow health, but they tell us, you know, if a hedge is starting to get gaps, then it's likely that it's going to need a change of management soon, and quite likely rejuvenation. If a hedge is starting to get gaps and it doesn't see a change in management, then those gaps are likely to just get bigger and bigger, and the hedge again slowly disappears. We also look at the margin, and again, the margin not only protects the roots of the hedge from disturbance, but it's also great for wildflowers, grasses, which in turn are great for foraging and nesting birds, for small mammals, for insects. And we look at the base canopy, as we saw earlier. So the hedge density extending all the way to the ground is crucially important shelter for nesting birds, for insects, for reptiles, for mammals like hedgehogs, which like to take shelter at the base of hedgerows and hibernate there as well. So unfortunately, the base of a hedge can grow thin, many different reasons. One is grazing damage, sometimes deer damage as well, over trimming in an overmanaged hedge, or actually sometimes shading if your hedge has become really tall and overgrown. And this base canopy measure is actually a really good indicator that a hedge might need rejuvenation. By rejuvenation, I mean coppicing or laying. And lastly, but not least, very much not least, we count hedgerow trees. So hedgerow trees are vitally important. Over half of the priority species associated with hedges are dependent on hedgerow trees. So again, they provide songposts, territory markers, bird behaviours, points for butterflies to meet and mate, all sorts of things. But actually also other things, things like pollinators. So in a year where a hedge has been cut, it may not be providing flowers or fruits, but the hedgerow trees will. So again, really important for all sorts of different things. So this is an example of what the feedback looks like on the left. You won't be able to read that here, don't even try, it's far too small. But at the very top, there is a score, that's your hedgerow health score. And it gives you some broad brush management advice tailored to that hedge. Below, there are 3 separate scores, one based on the structure, the biodiversity, and the connectivity values of your hedgerows. So again, these different scores means that you may have different areas to focus on. You might be absolutely fine for your structure and your biodiversity, but lacking maybe in the connectivity. It helps you understand, you know, which part of that hedge needs a bit more work. So each of these hedges survey will automatically generate a PDF of this advice, which can be sort of downloaded or shared, whatever. Now, different survey groups come to the hedgerow survey for different reasons. But my absolute favourite model is when a group starts by talking to farmers. So going to farmers, seeing whether this sort of hedgerow health check would be something that they could utilise, and then passing on all of this management guidance when the surveys are done. Our other hedgerow survey is called Healthy Hedgerows, and it is a free rapid assessment hedge management app. Again, designed specifically for farmers and land managers. It's very simple to do, just 6 questions, and it's really, really quick to use. And again, it provides instant management. It doesn't do the condition assessment because we've only got 6 things that we've asked, but it does instant management advice for each of the hedges surveyed. And again, this is largely based on that inherent life cycle of a hedge as outlined by that cycle based on Nigel Adams's work. So it's designed as a simple tool to help a farmer, any farmer interested in transitioning back to that traditional management cycle. So it might be easy to apply the hedge life cycle to 1 or maybe 2 hedges, but actually to do that across a whole farm is really difficult. And that's where we thought, the speed and the simplicity of this app could come in. So for the Healthy Hedgerows app, you have 6 questions, and they're all either multiple choice or simple average measurements. And then every hedge that gets surveyed gets drawn onto a map that you can use to help plan future hedge management. And there's guidance on the website to help work out which hedges to prioritise and how to make that sort of decision. So again, this is completely free to download and to use. If you don't have a phone that supports apps, then you can go on the website, which has exactly the same functionality replicated. And again, it takes hardly any time to do. We think maybe 2 minutes per hedgerow. This one best done in the winter time, because we don't look at species here, we're just looking at the structural health of the hedgerow. And it's much easier to see what's going on with a sort of structural hedge when the hedge hasn't got any leaves on it. So what do we want to see? As the old adage goes, you can't improve what you're not measuring. So these surveys are designed to improve hedgerows one by demystifying hedgerow management and offering bespoke management advice. The Countryside Survey is vital at a national level to help us understand hedgerow health and inform national decision making. It's remarkable until recent, we're still looking at the 2007 data and using that as our decision making. So it's going to be fantastic when we've got this update. Whereas our PTS hedge surveys, I would say, complement this work by working at a more local level and helping inform the management decisions of a hedge on a hedge by hedge basis. So what do we ultimately want to see? I would say we want to see hedgerows bigger, better and more joined up, fulfilling their potential economically, ecologically and environmentally, and managed on a life cycle which includes rejuvenation. And personally, I also want to see fewer gaps and more trees. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan. That was absolutely fantastic. Brilliant. And thank you, Lisa, as well. They're both really good talks in terms of kind of really all those factors that make a healthy hedge, and really kind of understanding that the more we do look at our hedges, whether that's on a national scale or whether it's on an individual hedge scale, we're going to start to really kind of build that picture, really get to know them and make good positive decisions for hedgerows in the future, whether that's the hedge in front of us and how we manage it, or whether that's government policy and farming and how we kind of talk to the wider communities. So thank you very much, both of you. That was really good. I'm going to go to our question and answer box now, conscious just of time. So I'll try and get through as many as I can. If people need to go, but I think we can stay and answer a fair few of them. So the first one was was to Lisa, and it's, are hedges that are surveyed in each square the exact hedges included in the previous survey, or a random sample in each square?
Okay, so they are the exact hedges. So we map the whole, all hedges in the 1 kilometre square if we can. The proviso is that we don't always get access to the whole square, and that can change between surveys. But as far as possible, we're going back to every single hedge in every square. There were 591 squares surveyed in 2007. There will obviously be less than that in England alone, but still nearly 300. So we go back to exactly the same hedges to map them, and we go back to exactly the same plots. So they're really carefully recorded in terms of location and photographed and mapped, and we go back and look at the exact same places. Yeah, best way to measure change. Otherwise you can just get the difference between one section and the next section. Good question.
Brilliant, thank you. And this is one that came in, Lisa, while you're talking, but I think Megan may answer it as well, so you can go to both of you. But it's, how do we convince landowners to invest in good hedge management? I've recently got funding from the Forestry Commission to train in hedge laying, which is great, but will landowners invest?
I think it's a really important question. We are looking within this current survey, we're specifically looking for the options of planting and rejuvenation. We want to see what those hedges look like after those things have happened, but not finding very many examples. So most farmers have traditionally been paid just to manage their hedges in certain ways, 2 out of every 3 years or something like that. But we're really hoping that there is a shift towards these much more, as Megan really well described, these much more rejuvenation approaches, which are actually going to revitalise the hedges from the bottom up instead of just trimming them endlessly on the sides. So yeah, what I would hope is that the government really properly invests, because these are expensive things for farmers to do, and farmers are quite up against it, very many of them, particularly the ones with quite good hedges, livestock farmers, and so yeah, they probably need to support to make this happen. Over to Megan.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate that's really important. You know, I think there will be a number of ways of incentivizing farmers, and I think the sustainable farming incentives, which is the new government scheme coming out, will be one. But as Lisa said, you know, we can't just keep trimming. You know, at the moment, a lot of that is about just trimming styles and trimming frequencies. And while that's good, you know, trimming your hedge every 3 years is good, unless that also includes rejuvenation, it's just slowing the decline. You know, it does need that rejuvenation. You know, it might just be once every 40 years or so, but it needs that to reset it. You know, the 3-year trimming and the incremental trimming is great, but we need to keep that rejuvenation in there as well. But I think just singing about how important hedges are, I think, you know, I haven't really met a farmer that hasn't seen wildlife as an important thing on their farm. You know, farmers do care about wildlife, and you know, it's important for them to, you know, to notice that. But also all the other benefits of hedgerows. You know, they can be helping the farm. You know, they weren't there just to keep the cows in. That wasn't their only function. It never has been. So barbed wire fences don't adequately replace hedges. And we know that because, you know, they reduce soil erosion. They're really important, particularly for livestock, not just to keep the cows in, but diet supplements. You know, they'll always browse on hedgerow lines for all the micronutrients that you can get from hedge browse. Really important for shade and for shelter, which is, again, with the extremes of weather that we're seeing, and we'll probably be seeing more in the future, sadly, you know, fantastically important to have shade and shelter for livestock. Just there's so many ways in which hedges do actually benefit a landowner and a farmer. I think we just need to be singing about these, really.
Definitely. Brilliant.
As well as properly funding them, we also need to properly fund them. But yes. I mean, I've seen the updated rates that farmers get paid for some of these land management have recently gone up. So the new rates that have been announced by the government are significantly higher than the old rates. So hopefully that will help as an incentive to do things like hedge laying, coppicing, rejuvenation techniques. Fingers crossed.
Which links nicely actually to Kate's question, which is around, is there any help and support for managing hedges? So we can talk about kind of help and support in terms of monetary things, but also help in terms of, she's got a 100-meter moderately healthy roadside hedge, and she needs some help and advice to help plan the best way to manage it.
I'd just plug my app, really. Just plug it into the app and see what the app says. Generally, I would say just don't manage it the same every year. The simple thing that will help a lot of hedges is just cut it slightly higher, slightly wider every year. That does a lot of things. If you can't, you might not be able to trim it slightly wider depending on how close it is to the road. But actually, this incremental trimming does a lot of things. So firstly, cutting it at the same height creates like a scar knuckle. You want to avoid that. If you cut it slightly higher, you get a band of second-year wood all the way around your hedge every single year. Now that's where you get the best flowers, that's where you get the best fruits. So even just cutting it 10 centimeters higher each year is going to do brilliant things for wildlife. It also means you've retained some of the leaves on it. And if you think about it, sort of normal hedge trimming season, a hedge might get leaves on it from about this time of year, so sort of early May, and then they may get trimmed at the beginning of September when the bird nesting season is over. So that's what, May, June, July, August. That's 4 months where the hedge has got leaves on it. If you trim it slightly higher and wider, or maybe trim it in the winter time instead, then it's more of the year that hedge can be photosynthesizing. That means it's less stressed every time it gets trimmed. And the less that we stress our hedges, you know, the slower they will be to decline. Again, they will just decline still, just a bit slower. And then at some point, you know, have a look at the structure and see as and when it might need rejuvenation through laying or maybe coppicing, depending on what you prefer.
And if you wanted to look at laying or coppicing or planting a new hedge, is there any financial help out there for people that aren't farmers? Kate's asking.
I was going to say that I'm sure there's some woodland trust schemes that help with hedges, but I'm not sure if it's particularly aimed at other private landowners apart from farmers. But there might be funding like that. You could look at the woodland trust as a possibility if you've got probably a reasonable length of hedge to get funding for, I would imagine.
And if it's for laying, that is going to be a difficult one. 100 meters, you might get away with contacting your local wildlife trust or CPRE group, because they are doing fantastic work on hedges in their local areas. And it could be that, you know, they're running a hedge laying training and need a hedge to work on. So it's worth asking. I know people that have made that one work. Yeah, or learn to do it yourself. Hedge laying, you know, it's depending on the hedge. I do a couple of hedges every year just for fun. It's brilliant. And actually, what I would say is you don't really fully understand a hedge until you've laid a hedge and seen it regrow. And that's when you can really, like, almost emotionally understand how that hedge cycle works and why that cycle sort of makes hedges immortal. Why it's so essential to their life history.
Fabulous, that's brilliant. And just having a look, another one about buying hedges. Where can I buy native hedging plants from? So I do know a lot of kind of garden centres. So one of our partners is Dobby's Garden Centre, and they do sell native species. You can sometimes you go to garden centre, they're the ones at the back and they're a bit more kind of hidden away. But we're working with people like Dobby's to say, can we have it kind of more in the forefront? If you can go to a community tree nursery, you've got one near you, one that's been grown by local people, means you've got locally sourced provenance, which would be the kind of ideal place to get your hedging from.
Yeah, absolutely. Having as local a stock as you possibly can is really important. And I think it's really important to note that all of these hedges that are going in, that are being planted, it's fantastic, but a lot of them will be fairly low genetic diversity. So some of our old hedges have like the population genetics of like the ancient world, but essentially some of our old hedges are just so genetically diverse that actually, you know, replacing it with a new hedge that's been bought from a garden centre is great, but you know, it doesn't have that robustness, that genetic population robustness. And why that's important, I think that's going to be increasingly important, especially with climate change. Genetic diversity is basically a tree population's best defense against unknown threat to the future. So if you take oak trees, I've got a few oak trees behind me. They look slightly different. The acorns look slightly different, and they do differently in different climates. You know, if you think one oak tree might be okay at surviving floods, another oak tree might have genes that make it better in a drought. A third oak tree might have inherent tolerance to whatever new tree disease is around the corner. Making sure we've got all of those genes represented in the next generation of trees and hedges is really important. So as Annie said, if you've got a local tree nursery, like a community tree nursery, or a tree nursery that's collecting seed from the wild, better yet, do it yourself. Really I've got an old bathtub and I go around, I collect sort of all sorts of fruits and nuts and things from the hedges, and I chuck them in a bathtub that I've got full of soil. And they grow up, and they're, you know, you're not going to be able to plant a hedge from your small bathtub, but it's great at sort of topping up, filling in gaps, that sort of thing, and really making sure that you've encaptured that genetic diversity that you've got around you, and making sure that's represented in the next generation of hedges is really, really important.
Brilliant. Yeah, Laura says, I've been collecting seeds from walks and potting them on. One day I'll have space for a hedge. So yes, that's brilliant. Yeah.
That's what you want to
plan now, and then you'll have your species ready for when you want to plant your hedge. I think we've just got time for one more. Judith's asked about ideas to address the lack of skilled manual help, talking about how the older population is growing older and the younger population is less unskilled. And that kind of links into some of the other kind of comments around flailing's very kind of prominent. We don't necessarily have that kind of skill set quite so much in the countryside anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think Megan's probably got a better answer, but I think there's absolutely, hedges aren't the only thing where we're lacking skill sets for alternative types of management in the countryside. It's something I love to see the agricultural colleges really pushing out to new farmers and new entrants, because hedges could be really important to them from agri-environment scheme perspectives, or possibly even from private funding perspectives for biodiversity or for carbon. And so, yeah, really we should be encouraging farmers themselves to learn these skills, but also, yeah, I agree, other youngsters who are interested in working in the countryside, being taught these skills through colleges and things would be great. But yeah, Megan, you got other thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, basically the same. I think it's hugely important. There have been some schemes that are being run to help train young hedge layers, which is fantastic. We need more hedge layers. I managed to convince my sister to become a hedge layer, which I'm very proud of. I'm not entirely sure she's classed as young anymore, sorry Soph, but it's a very important thing to do. On the flailing side of things, I wouldn't demonize the flail completely. So again, as Lisa was saying, we went through a few dark decades when we had government incentivizing farmers to take their hedges out. The fact that we still have hedges when farmers were being paid to remove them, I think is a miracle, which is, it's brilliant. But I think we would have lost more if we didn't have something that was really quick and easy and cheap to manage our hedges with. So if there wasn't a flail already there, you know, after the war, we didn't have as much manpower in farms. We didn't have as many people working on farms. So if there wasn't something like the flail there, I think we would have lost more during that sort of big grub out of hedges that we saw sort of 60s and 70s and a bit in the 80s. And they can be, you know, they can be mismanaged and used terribly, but again, they can be made to use as a really effective tool. Again, you know, all it would take with the flail is to ease off a little bit, so you don't have to trim them back to the same shape every year. You could trim them a little bit higher and a little bit wider, and that sort of mimics a little bit how we used to trim them by hand. So when we trimmed them by hand, we'd use a brushing up hook to like a big scythe on it, like a hook on a stick basically, and we'd sort of slash up. That left a sort of the woody bit that would have grown earlier in the spring. Hedges would get slightly bigger each year. We can do that with the flail. We don't have to go back to hand tools to manage our hedgerows. I would say if we encourage people to go back to hand tools and traditional methods for our hedges, we will probably not see many people want to plant more, because that is a huge, you know, that's a huge commitment for a farmer to do, and there isn't the manpower. So I think what we need to do is encourage better use of the tools we've got, and then encourage them to just tweak the way they're using the flail, and then encourage them to, you know, occasionally put these hedges through a rejuvenation. And again, it doesn't have to be too frequently. If you're good with your trimming and you put it into like a sensible trimming regime, then it might just be 40 years. Once in a generation, each hedge needs to be laid or coppiced, and it makes it much more manageable. And in fact, the flail, oh, sorry, I'm going on far too long. We had time for one more question. The flail, what it can do is it can like extend the period of time over which you cycle through your healthy hedge cycle. Now, if we didn't have a tool like a flail, you'd get through that cycle in about 15 years. Now, with something like a flail, you can extend that to 40 years. Which makes it much more manageable to be rejuvenating our hedges. Again, much easier to rejuvenate them over 40 years than every 15. So flails, I know they have a bad rep, and sometimes deservedly, because they're not always used in the best of ways, but it's just how we use the tool. It's not the tool itself.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm afraid we are short on time. A few people have put in questions kind of asking quite specific things around planting hedgerows. If you can want to, you can always email in your questions, but if you want to have a look on the HedgeLink website, we're all a member of the HedgeLink network, and on that website we've got loads of different resources to tell you all about how to plant hedges, what species to use, whether it's your garden, whether it's countryside hedge. So please do check out the HedgeLink website. So I'd like to say thank you so much on behalf of myself, the Tree Council, to both Megan and Lisa for our talk tonight. I'm sure everybody agrees that it was absolutely fantastic. learned loads about hedges, and really appreciate your time tonight. So thank you everybody for coming, and thank you Megan and Lisa for tonight.